In my years of study at Oxford and Lincoln's Inn, then in the councils of kings and the chambers of scholars, I witnessed a peculiar phenomenon that persists to this day. Many believe that faith and reason exist in perpetual conflict, that to embrace one, you must abandon the other. This false dichotomy has impoverished both believer and skeptic alike. The faithful retreat into pietism without substance, while the secular mind grows proud yet shallow, mistaking cleverness for wisdom. But what if this supposed war between faith and reason is itself the greatest lie ever told? What if faith, properly understood, actually sharpens the mind rather than dulls it? In my own journey from young lawyer to humanist scholar to reluctant martyr, I discovered that Christian faith doesn't make you less intelligent, it makes you more perceptive about reality itself. It opens intellectual doors that pure rationalism cannot even see, let alone unlock. Today, we'll explore why the marriage of faith and reason produces not confusion, but the clearest vision of truth available to the human soul. Chapter 1: The Great Deception: How Rationalism Became Irrational. The irony is breathtaking. In our age, those who pride themselves on pure reason have become the most irrational of all. They've created an elaborate philosophical system based on a single, unproven assumption that material reality is all there is. This isn't rational, it's faith in disguise, but faith without humility. Consider how this plays out in practice. The materialist examines a sunset and declares it nothing but light wavelengths hitting retinal cells. He dissects love into chemical reactions and reduces consciousness to neural firing patterns. But notice what's happening. He's explaining away the very experiences that make life meaningful. This isn't wisdom, it's intellectual vandalism. True reason doesn't destroy mystery, it recognizes the limits of its own tools. When I studied law at the Inns of Court, I learned that a good lawyer knows not just what he can prove, but what he cannot. The rationalist who claims certainty about God's non-existence has abandoned this fundamental intellectual virtue. He's made an infinite claim based on finite evidence, the very definition of irrationality. Faith, properly understood, does the opposite. It begins with honest acknowledgement of what we don't and can't know through natural reason alone. But here's the key insight: faith then provides additional data points that make better sense of reality as a whole. It's not anti-rational, it's trans-rational. When I studied the great philosophers, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, I discovered they all understood this principle. They used reason to its fullest extent, then recognized that reason itself points beyond itself to truths that require revelation to grasp fully. This isn't intellectual defeat, it's intellectual maturity. The mind that remains open to divine illumination sees further than the mind that artificially constrains itself to purely material explanations. The result is counterintuitive but undeniable. Those who combine rigorous reason with humble faith consistently demonstrate greater intellectual depth, more accurate predictions about human behavior, and more creative solutions to complex problems. They're not less smart, they're operating with a fuller dataset about reality's true nature. Chapter 2: The Cognitive Advantages of Theological Thinking. My years translating Greek and Latin texts taught me something remarkable. The greatest minds in history were almost universally men and women of faith. This wasn't coincidence or cultural conditioning. Theological thinking itself develops cognitive capacities that pure secularism cannot match. First, theology trains the mind to handle paradox and complexity. In my theological debates, I learned to hold apparently contradictory truths in creative tension: divine sovereignty and human freedom, justice and mercy, transcendence and immanence. This intellectual discipline proves invaluable in every field. The theologian understands that reality is more nuanced than our categories, more mysterious than our models. Secular thinking, by contrast, tends toward reductionism. It seeks to explain complex phenomena through simpler mechanical processes. While this approach has value in certain contexts, it creates intellectual blind spots. The materialist struggles to explain consciousness, meaning, love, beauty, and moral obligation because his paradigm lacks the conceptual tools to handle these realities adequately. Second, faith-informed reason develops what we might call vertical thinking, the ability to see connections between different levels of reality. The believer recognizes that material, psychological, moral, and spiritual dimensions all interact in complex ways. This produces more sophisticated analysis of human behavior, social dynamics, and cultural trends. During my time as Lord Chancellor, I constantly drew upon this multidimensional perspective. Legal problems were never merely technical, they involved questions of justice, human nature, divine law, and social harmony. The secular mind tends to fragment these connections, treating each domain as autonomous. But reality isn't fragmented, it's an integrated whole that requires integrated thinking to understand properly. Third, theological reflection cultivates intellectual humility combined with confident reasoning. The believer knows he doesn't know everything, but he also knows that truth exists and can be partially grasped through careful study and divine grace. This produces a distinctive intellectual stance, bold in pursuing truth, humble about personal limitations, confident in reason's capacity when properly ordered. Compare this to secular alternatives. Pure skepticism leads to intellectual paralysis. If we can't know anything with certainty, why study at all? Pure rationalism leads to intellectual pride, the assumption that unaided human reason can master all reality. Only faith-informed reason achieves the optimal balance, energetic inquiry grounded in realistic assessment of human cognitive abilities. Chapter 3, Pattern Recognition, Why Believers See More Clearly. During my humanist studies, I discovered that Christian scholars possessed an unusual advantage in recognizing patterns across different domains of knowledge. This wasn't mere confirmation bias, it was enhanced perception rooted in understanding reality's underlying unity. The secular mind approaches each field of study as essentially autonomous. Biology operates by different rules than psychology, which operates by different rules than sociology, which operates by different rules than physics. This compartmentalization misses crucial connections. The believer, however, expects to find consistent patterns across all levels of reality because everything reflects the same divine wisdom and creative intention. This expectation proves remarkably fruitful. Christian thinkers consistently made breakthrough discoveries by applying insights from one domain to another. They recognized mathematical patterns in music, musical patterns in poetry, poetic patterns in natural phenomena, and natural patterns in moral law. Their faith didn't blind them to these connections, it sensitized them to look for deeper unities. Consider how this works in practice. The believer studying human nature expects to find traces of divine design, complex systems serving purposes, elegant solutions to functional problems, built-in capacities for growth and development. This expectation leads to research questions that materialists might miss. Why do humans have such sophisticated linguistic abilities? Why do we create art and music? Why do we experience moral obligations? Why do we long for meaning beyond survival? The secular researcher often treats these phenomena as mere evolutionary accidents, byproducts of selection pressures that served reproductive fitness in ancestral environments. But this reductionist approach frequently misses the deeper patterns and more elegant explanations. The believer's expectation of purposeful design often leads to more accurate descriptions of how complex systems actually function. Moreover, faith provides a framework for interpreting apparent randomness and chaos. Where the secular mind sees meaningless accident, the believer often discovers hidden order operating according to principles not yet fully understood. This doesn't mean everything is immediately explainable, but it encourages persistent inquiry based on confidence that reality is ultimately intelligible. My own study of law exemplified this principle. English common law seemed chaotic to purely logical analysis, a hodgepodge of precedents, customs, and arbitrary decisions. But when viewed through the lens of divine providence working through human history, patterns emerged. The law gradually developed toward greater justice and wisdom, not through human planning but through the mysterious process by which divine truth manifests itself through imperfect human institutions. This perspective produces what I call patient intelligence, the willingness to study complex phenomena over long periods, confident that deeper understanding will eventually emerge. Secular thinking often demands immediate explanations and tends to dismiss what cannot be quickly categorized. Chapter 4: The Moral Foundation of Clear Thinking. Perhaps the most crucial way faith enhances intelligence is by providing moral foundation for honest thinking. In my legal practice, I learned that intellectual corruption almost always begins with moral corruption. People reach false conclusions not because they lack reasoning ability, but because they're motivated to avoid certain truths. The secular mind faces a fundamental problem. If there's no objective moral order, then intellectual honesty becomes merely personal preference. Why choose truth over convenience, accuracy over advantage, difficult reality over comforting illusion? The materialist can provide no compelling answer except arbitrary personal choice or social convention. Faith solves this problem by grounding intellectual virtue in divine commandment and ultimate reality. The believer pursues truth not merely because it's useful, but because truth-seeking reflects God's own nature and honors the one who created both mind and reality. This provides powerful motivation for intellectual integrity even when truth proves personally costly. Consider how this plays out in controversial areas of inquiry. The secular researcher studying human behavior faces enormous pressure to reach conclusions that align with current political orthodoxies, career advancement, and social approval. Without transcendent moral foundation, why resist these pressures? Why suffer professional consequences for unfashionable truths? The believer operates within a different framework. God commands truth-telling regardless of social consequences. The created order exists independently of human preferences and deserves honest description regardless of political implications. This doesn't guarantee that believers always reach correct conclusions, but it provides stronger motivation for intellectual courage. During my own confrontation with King Henry VIII, this principle proved decisive. Secular calculation suggested I should accommodate royal demands. My family needed my income. My friends valued my companionship. My nation benefited from my service. Pure reason could construct convincing arguments for compromise. But faith provided non-negotiable foundation. Some truths matter more than personal consequences. This same principle applies in less dramatic contexts. The Christian scholar studying economics isn't free to ignore evidence about human nature that contradicts utopian schemes. The believer examining history can't dismiss inconvenient data about human depravity or divine providence. Faith demands intellectual honesty about reality as it actually exists, not as we might prefer it to be. Moreover, faith provides resources for handling cognitive dissonance and uncertainty. The secular mind often becomes paralyzed when facing questions that threaten fundamental assumptions about reality's nature. The believer can acknowledge mystery and uncertainty without abandoning the quest for truth, confident that partial understanding is still valuable and that fuller comprehension may emerge through continued faithful inquiry. This creates what might be called fearless curiosity, willingness to investigate difficult questions without predetermined conclusions, trusting that truth and divine revelation will ultimately prove compatible. Chapter 5: Integration versus Fragmentation, the Unified Mind. In my years of humanist study, I observed a striking difference between secular and religious approaches to knowledge. Secular education tends toward increasing specialization and fragmentation. Students master narrow disciplines but lose sight of how different fields relate to each other and to life's larger questions. Faith-based education, properly conducted, produces the opposite result, increasing integration and synthesis. This isn't accidental. The secular worldview lacks any principle of ultimate unity. If reality consists of nothing but matter in motion, then connections between different phenomena are merely coincidental. Mathematics relates to music only by historical accident. Biology connects to ethics only through arbitrary human preference. Physics has nothing meaningful to say about poetry. Christian faith provides a different foundation. If one divine intelligence created and sustains all reality, then deep connections exist between every aspect of creation. Mathematical elegance reflects divine beauty. Biological complexity reveals divine wisdom. Moral law participates in divine justice. Physical order manifests divine reliability. These aren't poetic metaphors, they're statements about reality's fundamental structure. This perspective produces what medieval scholars called the unity of knowledge. Every valid insight in any field ultimately relates to every other valid insight because all truth originates from the same divine source. This doesn't mean differences between disciplines disappear, but it suggests that genuine understanding requires seeing how particular truths fit within the larger tapestry of reality. Consider how this integration works in practice. During my diplomatic missions, I regularly drew upon theological insights to understand political behavior, classical literature to illuminate legal principles, natural philosophy to inform economic policy, and moral theology to guide diplomatic strategy. This wasn't dilettantism, it was recognition that human problems are multidimensional and require multidimensional solutions. The secular mind struggles with this integration because it lacks unifying principles. Each discipline develops its own methodologies, assumptions, and vocabularies that prove difficult to translate across academic boundaries. The result is intellectual fragmentation, specialists who know more and more about less and less, unable to address complex real-world problems that don't respect disciplinary boundaries. Faith-informed education produces the opposite effect. Specialists who maintain awareness of how their particular expertise relates to broader questions of human flourishing and divine purpose. The Christian physician understands that healing bodies serves larger purposes than merely extending biological existence. The believing economist recognizes that material prosperity means nothing apart from just distribution and human dignity. The faithful artist knows that beauty points beyond itself to transcendent realities. This integration proves especially valuable in leadership roles. During my time as Chancellor, I faced complex problems requiring legal expertise, political wisdom, economic understanding, moral discernment, and spiritual insight. Secular education would have prepared me to excel in one domain while remaining ignorant about the others. Humanist formation within Christian faith provided tools for seeing how different considerations related to each other. The result isn't intellectual confusion but intellectual sophistication, the ability to handle complex problems with appropriate nuance and depth. Chapter 6: Faith as Epistemic Courage, Facing Hard Truths. One of faith's most underappreciated intellectual benefits is the courage it provides for facing uncomfortable truths about human nature and social reality. The secular mind, lacking transcendent hope, often cannot bear to look honestly at how broken we truly are. It requires optimistic illusions about human perfectibility to maintain psychological stability. This creates systematic intellectual distortion. Secular social theories consistently underestimate human capacity for self-deception, cruelty, and irrationality. They overestimate our ability to reason dispassionately about our own interests. They assume that education alone can overcome deep-seated moral problems. These errors aren't accidental, they're psychologically necessary for minds that see no hope beyond human effort. Faith provides different foundation. Because believers trust in divine grace and ultimate justice, they can afford to look honestly at human depravity without falling into despair. This produces more accurate assessment of what kinds of social reforms are actually possible and what kinds of institutional safeguards are necessary to constrain human corruption. My own study of history illustrates this principle. Secular historians often interpret historical events through optimistic narratives about human progress and enlightenment gradually overcoming ignorance and superstition. This requires systematically minimizing evidence of human wickedness and exaggerating evidence of human nobility. Christian historians can acknowledge both human dignity and human depravity without needing to choose between them. We're created in God's image but fallen through sin, capable of remarkable nobility but prone to remarkable corruption. This dual recognition produces more nuanced and accurate historical analysis. Consider how this applies to contemporary political debates. Secular progressives often assume that proper education and institutional reform can solve fundamental problems of human selfishness and irrationality. When reforms fail to produce expected results, they typically blame insufficient commitment or remaining traces of traditional prejudice rather than questioning their optimistic assumptions about human nature. Secular conservatives, lacking transcendent hope, often fall into opposite error, cynical resignation that assumes improvement is impossible and that we must simply accept current injustices as inevitable. They see human corruption clearly but lack resources for believing that positive change is possible. Faith-informed political thinking avoids both errors. It recognizes that human depravity makes utopian schemes impossible but that divine grace makes genuine reform possible. It supports practical improvements while maintaining realistic expectations about what can be achieved through human effort alone. This balanced perspective proves especially valuable in assessing proposed solutions to social problems. The believing mind asks not just, will this policy achieve its stated goals, but does this policy assume realistic or unrealistic things about human nature? Policies based on overly optimistic assumptions about human virtue will fail predictably. Policies that provide no outlet for legitimate human aspirations will create resentment and backlash. During my diplomatic work, this faith-grounded realism proved invaluable. I could negotiate with foreign powers without illusions about their trustworthiness while still believing that agreements were possible when properly structured with appropriate incentives and enforcement mechanisms. Chapter 7: The Practical Fruits: How Faith-Informed Reason Works Better. The ultimate test of any intellectual approach is practical effectiveness. Does it produce better predictions, more elegant solutions, and more flourishing communities? My experience suggests that faith-informed reason consistently outperforms purely secular alternatives across multiple domains. In legal practice, I discovered that judges who understood divine law produced more just and stable legal systems than those who relied solely on human reason or political expediency. Not because they ignored evidence or logical argument, but because they recognized deeper principles of justice that transcended immediate political pressures and cultural fashions. Similarly, in economic matters, merchants and administrators who understood their work as serving divine purposes and human dignity consistently created more sustainable and beneficial commercial relationships than those motivated purely by profit maximization. They were often more successful financially because they built trustworthy reputations and considered long-term consequences that short-sighted materialists ignored. The same pattern appears in education. Students who study within frameworks that integrate intellectual rigor with moral and spiritual formation consistently demonstrate greater creativity, better judgment, and more sustained motivation for learning than those receiving purely secular instruction. They're not less analytical, they're more motivated to analyze because they understand knowledge as participating in divine truth. This isn't mere correlation but causation. Faith provides intellectual resources that enhance rational thinking in several specific ways. First, it expands the dataset by including revealed truth alongside natural observation. Second, it provides interpretive frameworks that help organize complex information into coherent patterns. Third, it supplies motivation for honest inquiry even when truth proves personally or socially costly. Consider how these advantages compound over time. The secular researcher may achieve impressive short-term results within narrow specializations. But as problems become more complex and require integration across multiple domains, faith-informed approaches demonstrate superior performance. They're better equipped to handle paradox, uncertainty, and the kinds of multidimensional challenges that characterize real-world decision-making. Moreover, communities that successfully integrate faith and reason tend to be more stable, prosperous, and innovative than those that artificially separate them. They benefit from enhanced social trust, shared moral foundations, and longer-term thinking that considers both earthly and eternal consequences. My diplomatic missions provided numerous examples of this principle. Nations with strong religious foundations but sophisticated intellectual traditions, like Renaissance Italian city-states or medieval Islamic centers of learning, consistently punched above their weight in cultural influence and political effectiveness. They combined practical wisdom with transcendent vision in ways that proved remarkably durable. This doesn't mean faith automatically produces intelligence or that believers never make serious intellectual errors. But it does suggest that properly ordered faith enhances rather than hinders rational thinking. The key phrase is, properly ordered, faith that embraces rather than fears intellectual inquiry, that seeks integration rather than compartmentalization, that remains humble about human limitations while confident about divine revelation. The practical implications are significant for both individuals and societies. Personal formation that integrates rigorous intellectual training with serious spiritual development produces more capable leaders, more creative artists, more effective professionals, and more virtuous citizens. Conclusion. As I write these words, knowing they may be among my last, I'm struck by how completely my experience contradicts our culture's false dichotomy between faith and reason. The mind illuminated by divine grace doesn't become less rational, it becomes more perceptive about reality's true nature and structure. This isn't merely personal testimony but observable pattern throughout history. The greatest scientific discoveries, artistic achievements, philosophical insights, and social reforms have consistently emerged from communities that successfully integrated rigorous intellectual inquiry with humble faith in transcendent truth. The secular mind, despite its pretensions to rational superiority, has proven remarkably irrational in its core assumptions and practical applications. It claims certainty about uncertainties, reduces complexities to simplicities, and fragments knowledge that properly belongs together. Faith-informed reason offers a better alternative, intellectual courage grounded in moral foundation, analytical rigor directed by transcendent purpose, and synthetic wisdom that sees connections secular thinking misses. It doesn't make us infallible, but it makes us more capable of approaching truth with appropriate humility and confidence. I encourage you to test this claim in your own intellectual life. Don't accept it on my authority but examine whether integrating serious faith with rigorous reason enhances or diminishes your capacity for understanding reality and solving complex problems. I'm confident you'll discover what I discovered, that the marriage of faith and reason produces not confusion but clarity, not limitation but liberation, not less intelligence but more.